What happens when you make something disappear? If you refuse to process it, face it, finish it, isn't it inevitable that it will eventually come back to haunt you? And when the haunting becomes unavoidable, what tools do we use to deal with it? In Argentina's dirty war, 30,000 people who were considered a political threat were disappeared, and the government made no effort to identify or document them. This video is inspired by Mariana Enriquez's short story collection, The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, which merges horror, the supernatural, and political commentary. Though of course you don't have to have read the collection to understand the video, this was just an initial spark of inspiration behind it. I specifically want to focus on the concept of disappeared more generally, and what happens when we disappear something, anything. When disappearing becomes something you instate, and not something that happens to you. When it becomes active and not passive. All power dynamics are off, and the past begins to haunt. And what happens then? In Enriquez's stories, there are continuous instances of haunting, or being haunted, which often results in mental disturbance or unease. This suggests that obviously when we repress something or not try to fully process it, it will come back to haunt us. And it can be individual or even intergenerational. For example, in one story, a girl finds the bones of her dead great aunt in her backyard, and then she leaves them in the ground again. And years later, the ghost of the baby of her great aunt comes back to haunt her. In the Kids Who Come Back story, the children who first go missing or disappeared eventually come back, but it's not really them. They're ghosts who begin to haunt Buenos Aires. And what's interesting is that they all move together. They're even compared to a herd, a single organism, as if after death, individuality doesn't matter anymore. Everything merges into one. And maybe we're scared of that, and therefore we're scared of these ghosts. We're scared of becoming blurry, translucent, not entirely us. And the hauntings remind us of the blurry lines between life and death, between haunting and being haunted, between being or not being a person. What I also think the idea of haunting exemplifies in these stories is the merging of the haunting of the past and the surveillance culture of the present. For example, in Rambla Triste, one character says, "I wanted to have a baby at any cost, but when we started to try, I got the idea that the helicopters were coming after me, that they were flying around up there just to watch me." It seems as though we're haunted by time from all sides. We're haunted by the past, the collective and individual traumas, but we're also haunted by the present. We're haunted or hunted by helicopters or even by our own devices. And maybe the haunting of the past is only an intensification of the fact that even in the present we're always watched, observed, whether we want to or not. And I think this also links to the ideas around psychogeography and haunted spaces. And the question becomes, are we haunted because the spaces are haunted? Or do the spaces become haunted because we are? And this reinforces a sense of doubling. For example, the settings that are typically considered pretty or touristy, like Barcelona in the Rambla Triste story, or a beach in the Lookout story, become bleak and threatening and hostile. The spaces themselves begin to haunt you. And there is another quote in Rambla Triste about mad people in Barcelona. "Sometimes I think the crazies aren't people, they're not real. They're like incarnations of the city's madness, like escape valves. If they weren't here, we'd all kill each other or die or stress. So even the city's madness is linked to people's madness. It almost creates a loop. The world is mad, so the city's mad. So we are even madder." And then Barcelona is also depicted as a space that is only safe when you keep moving. Otherwise, water is splashed at you, or you're haunted by the ghosts of the past. So the city encourages us to keep moving, to never stand still, never just exist. This city is making us crazy because we never know where we stand, or even if we're allowed to stand. And again, we're haunted both by the past, by the ghost children that externalize the inequalities and violence and neglect, and the present, the helicopters, water being splashed, the crazy people. We are not welcome in these spaces. They try to tell us something, along with the ghosts. And as I said, being haunted often results in mental disturbance. But also in these stories, sometimes the mentally ill are not just the haunted, but also the haunting. which means the line between haunting and being haunted is blurry. It suggests that we eventually may haunt ourselves after we've been haunted long enough, as if we've absorbed the haunting and half-dead quality of the ghosts, and we begin to slip out of life. And the stories make it clear. The more issues one has, the more vulnerable they are to being haunted. And these ghosts may be ghosts from the past, history, violence, family, anything. But maybe if we become more aware of the ghosts that haunt us, we will become stronger to deal with them. And I think the horror genre may be one suggestion here. Anne Radcliffe, one of the pioneers of the Gothic genre, made a distinction between horror and terror. She wrote, "Terror and horror are so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. The other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them." Where lies the great difference between horror and terror, but an uncertainty and obscurity that accompany the first? And Enriquez's stories are typically considered horror, and they do deal with the very real horrors of life and the history of Argentina, often through a supernatural lens. And according to Devendra Varna, the difference between terror and horror is the difference between awful apprehension and sickening realization, between the smell of death and stumbling against a corpse. So in art, horror is obviously translated into terror. But if we want to translate it, we need to face it first. It is only through facing, acknowledging, understanding horror that we can move on to terror so that it can expand the soul. We may need to let ourselves be haunted, willingly, so that we don't eventually begin to haunt, to fear, to become completely dejected. Ghosts are everywhere, individual and collective ones, but disappearing anything will only make it stronger. This is another part of my series where I read the books from the International Booker Prize shortlist, and I use them, the themes in them, as a backdrop to the topics I usually discuss on this channel, so I'm yet to cover the other books in future videos. And as for the collection itself, though I did not like the first story, I then enjoyed each one more and more until I was completely hooked. I really love the author's imagination, and aside from what I discussed in the video, the stories definitely give you insight into the hauntings of Argentina, some of its history, and how it manifests itself in the experiences of primarily women. So I definitely recommend that one too. As the author said about her stories, "I don't think my characters overcome their guilt. That's the whole point in some stories, because their guilt is not individual. In the same way, although they can be punished, they won't find it soothing because it's not them individually that deserve the punishment. In some cases, the characters are involved in social situations that they just can't fix. Their good intentions are punished because they're dealing with something way beyond them. You can't save yourself alone. That's what Western culture proposes, and we have internalized it and think it's normal. But when faced with real horrors, we realize we're totally powerless. When we're faced with horrors, this powerlessness can become debilitating and alienating, which is also clear in some of the stories. But sometimes, if we try to look deeply into these horrors together, maybe we can transform some of it into terror, if only temporarily, to understand it better, and maybe gain some power so that we have the tools to really change things. I hope you enjoyed the video as well as the series as a whole. Let me know if you like this kind of thing. I certainly enjoy talking about books in this way. And as always, thank you for your time.